Shelley, can you give me a thumbs up if you're not seeing my notes and you're seeing? Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. We're going to keep going on the raptor train. And I'm going to talk a little bit about balancing the benefits and sometimes the costs of birds in agricultural landscapes and touching specifically on vineyards. So I'm a faculty member at Columbia University, but before I moved to New York, which is my hometown, before I moved back to New York City, I was in California for 5 years, where I was lucky enough to work with Brianna and some of the Barn Owl team who are all on this call, Ryan and Emily. And so that's when I got involved with the Wild Farm Alliance, and I did some work with vineyards in California as well. So I'm really happy. I don't know how many of you are California versus East Coast, and I don't know if we have time to go through what everybody is, but it's nice to see all of you, and thank you for spending time with us this morning. I'm just coordinating where you guys are on my screen. Okay, so I titled my talk Farm Friends and Farm Foes because I am really kind of enamored with the history of understanding the benefits and costs of birds for farmers. These are pictures of books that were published in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And these are the front pages up here: Farm Friends and Farm Foes, Useful Birds and Their Protections. This one is the food of orchard birds with respect to a specific pear pest. And this is a picture from one of those old books of, you can see, like the modern automobile at the time being used to move nest boxes onto. This was a pear orchard, I believe. So the idea of using birds and kind of working with birds and working with ecology of natural systems to promote balance in systems is not a new and groundbreaking one, which sometimes it seems to be, because this science and this kind of focus on working with nature really just disappeared off the charts altogether around the 1930s predominantly. And the main reason for that is because pesticides became widespread and abundant after the world wars. And so for those of you that have been farming for generations, your grandparents and great-grandparents might have been reading these documents and might have been utilizing some of the things that we're talking about today to try to manage pest birds and pest insects and pest rodents on their property before chemical pesticides were an option for doing that. So it's really exciting that there's really been a resurgence in interest in this, both from the scientific community and from the farming community. And I think many of you and many of the farmers before you will have been continuing to do these sorts of things even when they weren't necessarily getting as much attention. So Aldo Leopold is one of the fathers of modern conservation, and he was a farmer as well as being a conservation biologist. I'm a conservation biologist and an agroecologist, and I work on birds. But the tie together between agriculture and conservation doesn't always get made. But in the early days of conservation, this focus was there, and this kind of attention was there. And I love this picture. This is from the wall of the Yolo County Extension Office, and this was the competition they had for kids to draw farmer superheroes. So I love that this one was very literal, and they actually drew the farmer with a cape. But I also love how diverse this farm was that this kid drew. And I'm sorry, I don't have the child's name on here, and I also love that the farmer has like a sidekick bird in this picture. I think it's totally accurate. You may have heard that birds are not doing super well across North America. So a publication came out the year before last that showed that populations of birds across the continent had decreased by about 3 billion compared to the 1970s. So if you had gone out and counted birds in the 1970s, there would be 3 billion more than there are today. And so that's a really significant and disturbing reduction in the biomass of birds on our continent. And it really, I think, is a call to action for the need to incorporate production landscapes and agricultural landscapes into our kind of conservation psyche and the value of those lands and what that can mean for conservation across North America and the world. these are really productive and can be really valuable landscapes for conservation, and it can work both for nature and for people. So I'm running out of space on this map because I started creating it about 10 years ago to point out all of the different crops around the world where scientists had tried to assess where birds were beneficial to different crops. So with our focus today on vineyards, there's been work in New Zealand and California, which I'm going to talk about today, but also all around the world on many different crops, ranging from apples to palm oil, to a lot of different work on coffee and cacao, to this cluster in California where we've done a lot of different work. And it's just the science keeps on growing to show what benefits birds can provide to a variety of different crops. And there have been very few examples where the science hasn't said, yes, birds are eating pest insects in particular and providing really valuable services to farmers. And you can read all about this on the Wild Farm Alliance's website and on the Beneficial Birds document or report that we put out a few years ago, which makes the case for birds. There's this beautiful website where you can kind of scroll through and look up lots of different crops in different parts of the world and see what the science has been in those areas. But I know we're kind of a vineyard focused talk today. And I work with grape growers a lot, and I often kind of get this kind of response from them when I start talking about how great birds are. And that is something that we have to think about and work with and try to figure out how to manage best for, because vineyards can be, and other crops where birds like to eat the crop, can be really beneficial from a conservation perspective. And birds do often provide benefits to those crops, but if your crop is delicious and birds really like eating it, what are you going to do? How are you going to manage that? And so birds are pests, have been pests. The farm friends and farm foes side of things has always been there. Birds love eating fruit, as many of you will know. They love eating nuts. These are an endangered species of parrot in the Amazon, eating Brazil nuts. They love eating seeds. I did some work on sunflower seeds in California. And interestingly, the benefits of birds and other wildlife actually outweighed the cost of birds eating sunflowers, but I'm not going to talk about that work today. This is a catfish farm in Mississippi, and every one of those, I know it's a bit blurry, but every one of those black dots is a cormorant or other diving bird that we're really enjoying the food there. Birds can even be problems at feedlots where there can be huge numbers of birds. There are also concerns for food safety issues when the feedlots are near leafy green fields. And this is a flock of species called red-billed quelea, and these birds can build up to such large numbers in Africa that they can also contribute to human famine in years where crops are not doing well and there's drought. So birds as pests are definitely a concern around the world, and figuring out how to balance the role of your lands with kind of being able to produce on those lands and not lose too much to the birds is always a tricky thing, especially when you're doing something, raising a crop like grapes. So again, that document that we produced, this is the report that you can download for free from the Wild Farm Alliance website. And in this report, there's not only the kind of evidence that had been published at the time for birds being beneficial, but there's also information in there about how to manage and coexist with pest birds and what our kind of best practices are at the moment. Although there's definitely more research that needs to be done on how to kind of solve this issue. So one thing I want to highlight is that not birds that are considered kind of foes or that might be detrimental to grape growers or to other crops in around the time of harvest when your crops are ripening may be beneficial at other times in the year. So this is just, this is some kind of pilot data that I had from California Audubon where we just looked at a couple of farms and looked at the foraging guilds, basically the avian communities on these same farms in the spring and then in the fall. And the birds themselves, like the actual species on those farms, did not really change significantly across the 2 seasons. But because birds, like this is an example of a horned lark, so many of the omnivorous species and granivorous species and species that in the fall eat things like grapes or seeds or grain or other crops, in the breeding season, they are primarily insectivorous. So they mainly are eating insects. And that's because they are raising their young, which require high protein diets, and feeding grain to chicks or fruit to chicks would not be successful in terms of a nesting strategy. So a lot of birds become insectivorous in the spring. So that's a time of year when most birds, if not all birds, are beneficial to you. So you can see that almost everything is either insectivorous or omnivorous. And when these birds are breeding, most of what they are eating are potential pests in agricultural landscapes. But then in the fall, they switch their diets. They become more granivorous and omnivorous and frugivorous, and fewer of them are really only the species that focus on eating insects are continuing to do so. So I just wanted to point that out, because a bird that you might kind of be annoyed with, like if you're a grape grower, all of the blackbirds and starlings, they're out there, you know, potentially in flocks, driving you crazy and being something that you are concerned by. But all of those species in the spring are actually eating vast quantities of insects. And if you have insect pests in your vineyards, they could be doing you a really good service. So then it's figuring out how can you take advantage of that service and potentially provide habitat for lots of birds, and then manage for the detrimental side of those birds in the fall through doing things like trying to deter birds from your vineyard. And this is just an example of that. I did a small study in a vineyard in the Dunnigan Hills, and we found that we used what's called sentinel prey. So I used mealworms that were pinned to these really old vines, and looked at what proportion of those mealworms were removed over a 24-hour period in the spring. And in the fall, I went to the exact same locations and looked at how much damage there was to the grapes. And you can see there was pretty high, almost over 50% of the sentinel prey, these mealworms, were removed in the spring, right at the edge of the vineyard, right close to the habitat that birds were using. And that proportion dropped off as I kind of went out into the vineyard. And the same is true, although it's a lower number, about 15% of the grapes, although there were some bunches where there was very high damage, were damaged at the edge of the vineyard. And that dropped off pretty significantly. After about 50 meters, there was almost no damage. And that 50-meter number is pretty normal for what I've seen in terms of where bird damage really drops off in vineyards. So that document from the Wild Farm Alliance, it has information about some of the seasonality of different birds. And you can go to the tables in that document to kind of have an idea of which species are going to be beneficial year round, such as insectivores and carnivores, and which species are going to be beneficial at certain times of the year, such as omnivores and granivores. Okay, Shelley, how am I doing on time?
You have about 10 minutes. And so
cool.
You might want to leave 5 minutes for questions. So about 5 minutes for speaking.
Okay. So I wanted to, I want to present a case study of where kind of managing for pest birds and also conservation come together well. And this is work from my PhD, which I did in New Zealand on the New Zealand falcon. So this is a very handsome male New Zealand falcon. His name was Wilson, and he's gorgeous and very fierce. But they're also tiny, so like cutely fierce. And this work was done at the top of the South Island in New Zealand in Marlborough, which is where New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is from, and where most of the wine industry in New Zealand is. If you think you have bad bird damage problems, unless any of you are Kiwis, you probably don't know bird damage problems, because they have immense bird damage problems in New Zealand. New Zealand is this really unique area ecologically. There were no land-dwelling mammals on New Zealand until people arrived there. And it was a place really dominated by birds. And people, particularly Europeans, when they came to New Zealand, they decided it should look a lot like Europe. And they introduced a number of different birds so that it would seem more like Europe. And actually, kind of ironically, the starling was introduced. So the same starling we have in North America that was also introduced. The starling was partially introduced to New Zealand because they wanted it to control an insect pest called a grass grub. That was a pest in the late 1800s and continues to be today. And so they brought in this bird that probes into the grass with its beak to try to control that insect pest. And now it's one of the largest pests in New Zealand. So don't introduce birds to control pests. It doesn't work. Use what's around. So the European blackbird and the European song thrush were also introduced. All three of these culprits like to treat a bunch of grapes like we do. They like to go and pluck grapes off of the bunches. And so this is the damage. This is to some Gewürz, I think, some Gewürztraminer that I think a particularly neurotic song thrush did. They usually don't remove every single grape from a bunch like this, but these birds can cause significant amount of damage. And then this bird, the native silver-eye, so this is a self-introduced native that became widespread in New Zealand after large-scale agricultural changes to the region. Their Maori name, the indigenous people of New Zealand, the name for silver-eye is stranger, actually, because they weren't widespread until the vast changes that Europeans caused to the landscape. But these birds like to treat a bunch of grapes like they're at a buffet, and they like to go through, and I like to think of them kind of going through and go, oh, that one doesn't taste good. Let me taste that one over there and that one over there. And they're drinking the juice from inside these ripening grapes. And all of you grape growers out there know that this kind of damage, these puncture wounds, not only are bad for the actual grapes that are punctured, but juice seeping out of these grapes can cause botrytis infection, and that can lead to not only lost crop, but also a decreased quality in the wine. And so I'm going to play this for you, and I think you'll be able to hear this. This is just a little video that kind of illustrates, I think, how crazy the grape growers in New Zealand are going over the bird damage problem there, because it is so large.
Every year, thousands of starlings and hordes of avian pests descend on Marlborough's vineyards to gorge themselves on ripening fruit. Every year, grape growers combat this million-dollar problem with an arsenal of desperate measures.
See, I hope you could see that and hear that. They don't actually play classical music. They play loud sounds that are not pleasant. They do actually use shotgun. They do actually shoot at birds. The birds are all non-native species, and they're not protected by something like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act there. And yeah, so they're spending millions of dollars every year trying to deter birds from vineyards. And so in 2005, a project was started called Falcons for Grapes by a company from the UK called International Wildlife Consultants. And the idea there was to reintroduce falcons from the high country, which is really the only habitat that this endemic threatened species exists in New Zealand. And to take chicks from these nests and use a falconry technique called hacking to essentially raise them to be wild falcons, but to release them in a different location. And so what they were doing was reintroducing falcons into these vineyard-dominated valleys where they once existed historically, but had been driven out because of persecution by people and because of introduced predators, which are a major problem for all of the birds and other animals in New Zealand. So the assumptions of this project, as the name implies, were that the falcons would benefit the vineyards, as well as a number of conservation objectives, which I'm not going to get into today. So I did my PhD on this species. And one of the big questions was, if you put falcons, if you take a vineyard and you add a falcon to it, will it actually impact the birds, those pest birds in the vineyards? And the same is true if you take a vineyard and you add a falcon to it. What will that mean for grape damage? And so I'm just going to jump to the results because we don't have time to go into the details of the study itself. But what we found was that there was a significant reduction in those 3 species of European bird, but actually no change in the abundances of silver eyes. So these darker lines are vineyards without falcons, and these kind of gray lines below them are the vineyards with falcons. So comparing across the two. So that was interesting. And when you kind of looked at all the pest birds overall, there was a reduced abundance of pest birds. There was also a tendency, and this is true in all parts of the world, for starlings in particular, which are a flocking bird, to utilize the center of the vineyard, whereas these other species are really coming out of, or were coming out of the, in this vineyard's case, the trees along the edge of it. That they were going out and then damaging the grapes from kind of the edge. So flocking birds often do prefer to forage far away from trees. And the reason for that is because their primary defense from predators is to act like a school of fish. So to get up into a flock, I'm sure you've all seen murmurations of starlings, those beautiful pictures of big giant flocks of starlings kind of creating shapes in the sky. And so flocking birds, they need to see a predator coming so they can get into that flock and confuse the predator, but from their numbers. If they're all on the ground eating grapes, they're not going to be able to do that. So actually, even though vegetation at the edge of the field can cause more damage from some of these solitary birds, often the bulk of the damage comes from flocking birds because there can be so many more of them, but they don't like trees. So there's kind of a difficult balance there. But having more trees around your vineyard usually means you don't have the large flocks actually in those vineyards. And I'm sure some of you will have examples where that's not true, but generally that's true. So we looked at grape damage across the vineyards doing a random sampling technique. We sampled over 4,000 bunches over 2 years. And we looked at the 2 main crops in the region, Sauv Blanc and Pinot Noir. Counting damaged grapes is really time consuming and hard, but we counted on each bunch the number of grapes that had been pecked, so we could attribute that to the silver eyes, the numbers that had been removed, and then the number of undamaged grapes. So we were able to look at the proportion of grapes that were damaged by each of those birds as well as overall. We also looked at, for each site, how close it was to the nearest vegetation, and then what type of vegetation that was. So was it grasses? Was it small shrubs? Was it shrubs? Was it small trees, large trees? Water? Was it a building? Because starlings often nest in buildings and like to utilize them. And then we used a score for how much bird scaring each individual vineyard was doing, and of course, whether or not there was a falcon present there. And interestingly, when we looked at that damage, each habitat feature was associated with some increase in damage, but no single feature was overridingly important in predicting that damage. Silver eyes were hanging out close to the edge, so we were finding more peck damage closer to the edges of vineyards. And interestingly, the level of bird scaring employed didn't actually have a significant effect on the type of damage or the amount of damage that we found. But the big take-home message there was when falcons were present in the vineyard, there was a 69% reduction in the grape damage to those vineyards. And so at the time, and this was actually a year when they had some really low grape prices in Marlborough, but I calculated what the savings were per hectare for growers, and they were really significant. And this was due to 95% fewer removed grapes and a 55% reduction in pecked grapes. So really significant reductions as a result of falcons being present. And I think I'm probably out of time, so I'll stop on this slide. But as Brianna was just pointing out, I think most of you in North America, you're in a much better situation than growers in New Zealand are. You have all of these beautiful raptors that are pretty abundant. And that you can take action to really encourage and kind of boost on your lands, which is not only going to be beneficial for you from a potentially bird or rodent control perspective, but also is going to contribute to the conservation of these really important species. So you have a lot of power in your hands, those of you that are growers out there, to do a lot of good and to potentially also help with managing that balance on your land. So I think, yeah, I had some perch stuff, but Brianna talked about the perch stuff. So be the farmer superheroes. The first steps are really going out and spending time watching the birds on your property and observing them and seeing what's out there. There's a great app from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology called Merlin that I recommend to all the farmers I work with. It's free. It's really intuitive. It's really helpful for identifying birds that you see if you don't know what they are, and they kind of help you down the path of learning bird ID and learning who you share your land with. And it's really addicting. Once you get into birding, if you're not into it yet, you will love it. And these are all of the amazing people that I've had the benefit of working with, and organizations that have supported my research over time. And I'll leave this here. My Twitter handle is @wildfarms. I'm really pleased to be a collaborator with the Wild Farm Alliance. And you can email me at my Columbia email if you have questions outside of this. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was really great.